Amen. Job chapter 11 is about where we left off. In chapter 10, you have Job pleading with God. He would plead with God. He wants to ask God, like verse 18 of Job 10 and verse 18, "Why then have you brought me out of the womb? Oh, that I had perished and no eye had seen me." He's in tremendous amount of sorrow and pain, discomfort due to the afflictions that is on him, the afflictions that he's facing as a result of his disease, his heartache, his loss of everything. And he is under tremendous distress. And his friends are coming there, and they're talking to him now. And this is what this cycle of speeches is, back and forth. They're speaking with Job, and basically they're having a dialogue back and forth, and the friends are basically asking Job, "What have you done to deserve this? You certainly must have done something for this tragedy to befall you." And they're speaking some things about God which are partially true, but are applied in an incorrect way. And Job is basically saying, "I haven't done anything. I've been upright and righteous all my life, but I wish I were dead. I wish I had died." And he is really hating life, so to speak, due to everything that he's facing. In chapter 11, you have Zophar, the Naamathite, who speaks up. And in this discussion with Job, Zophar is going to really be hard on Job. We're going to see that from the passages that we're going to look at from chapter 11. Zophar the Naamathite answered and said, "Should not the multitude of words be answered? And should a man full of talk be vindicated? Should your empty talk make men hold their peace? And when you mock, should no one rebuke you? For you have said, my doctrine is pure, and I am clean in your eyes. But oh, that God would speak and open his lips against you, that he would show you the secrets of wisdom, for they would double your prudence. Know therefore that God extracts from you less than your iniquities deserve. Can you search out the deep things of God? Can you find out the limits of the Almighty? They are higher than the heavens, or heaven. What can you do? Deeper than Sheol. What can you know? Their measure is longer than the earth and broader than the sea." We'll stop right there. And we'll look at this. Zophar here is saying to him, "You have a multitude of words," verse 2, "should you not answer, not in the multitude of words be answered? And should a man full of talk be vindicated?" He says, you're having a lot of words, you're saying a lot of things. You should be vindicated by now. You seem to not have that vindication that you're longing for, and that should be there. And he says in verse 3, "Should your empty talk make men hold their peace? When you mock, should no one rebuke you?" So now he's accusing Job of mocking. And he says, this is what you say in verse 4, "My doctrine is pure, and I am clean in your eyes." And verse 5, "But oh, that God would speak and open his lips against you." So this is what he's saying Job is saying in verse 4. He's saying, you're claiming that your doctrine is pure, and I'm clean in your eyes. And so he is claiming that, Job, you claim to be pure. You claim to be righteous. But he wants God to speak and open his lips against him in verse 5. And he says in verse 6 that he would show you the secrets of wisdom, for they would double your prudence. Know therefore that God extracts from you less than your iniquities deserve. Now, that's a pretty harsh statement. Notice it again. Know therefore that God exacts from you less than your iniquities deserve. So he's accusing Job of what? Getting off easy. Exactly. What God is doing to you is exacting from you less than what you actually deserve. So he's being pretty hard on Job. And in verse 7, he says, can you search out the deep things of God? Can you find out the limits of the Almighty? And of course, the answer to that, the deep things of God, are things that we cannot know. The only thing we can know is what we can observe as far as in nature and learn from it. And of course, what is revealed. Deuteronomy 29:29 says, the secret things belong to the Lord. That which is revealed is for us and for our children. So there are some secret things, deep things of the Lord that we cannot know. And he's saying you cannot know these things. In verse 8 he says, they are higher than heaven. What can you do? It's so high, it's higher than the heaven, you can't attain to it. Deeper than Sheol. What can you know? Sheol is sometimes translated the grave, but oftentimes in a context it's referring to the unseen realm where our spirits go when we die. In the New Testament, it is called Hades, the unseen place. And when a person dies, their spirit goes to Sheol or Hades. And of course, within that place, there is the place of comfort, which is called Abraham's bosom in Luke chapter 16, or it's called torment, the place of punishment. And that's the place that all departed spirits go until the resurrection. And a little bit later on in these passages, we're going to look at the concept that Job had, the limited understanding, but a concept he had of a resurrection and an afterlife. And he says, the knowledge of God is deeper than Sheol. What can you know? Verse 9, their measure is longer than the earth and broader than the sea. Talking about the deep things of God, the limits of the Almighty. You can't know it. You can't know these things. And so he's speaking some truth about God. However, he is applying it to Job and saying basically to Job, Job, you're getting off light compared to what you must really deserve. Well, is that really comforting? Is that something that you want to hear from your friend? If you're laying up in the hospital and you got tubes all coming out, you're in pain, and your friend comes and says, you're getting off really light compared to what you really deserve. That's not something you want to hear. That's not comforting. And so you see this attitude that the Zophar has. So that brings us to chapter 12. You look at Job chapter 12. Job answers and says in verses 1 through 3, he says, no doubt you are the people and wisdom will die with you. But I have understanding as well as you. I am not inferior to you. Indeed, who does not know such things as these? So as he responds to that, he uses a little bit of sarcasm in verse 2. He says, no doubt you're the people and wisdom will die with you. In other words, you seem like you've got it all figured out. And you have wisdom, and once you die, wisdom's going to die with you because you are the ones who have it figured out. But he says there in verse 3, I have understanding as well as you. I am not inferior to you. Indeed, who does not know such things? So he says, I'm aware of some things as well. You have wisdom, but I have an awareness of some things as well. And he's going to talk about some of those things there in chapter 12 concerning providence and how God takes care of things and works providentially in the world. And he says there in verse 4, Job chapter 12 and verse 4, I am one mocked by my friends who called on God and he answered him. The just and the blameless who is ridiculed. A lamp is despised in the thought of one who is at ease. It is made ready for those whose feet slip. The tents of the robbers prosper, and those who provoke God are secure, and what God provides by His hand. Now notice what he says there in verse 4. I am one mocked by his friends. So Job is coming to realize that what they're saying to him is mockery. They're basically mocking him. Instead of making the situation better, they're basically mocking him. Especially when they say you're getting off easier than what you really deserve. That's not a comforting thing to say to anyone. And so he talks about them as those who are his friends who mock him. We talked about this earlier when we went into the book of Job, how sometimes when you're dealing with someone who's in distress and going through difficulty, sometimes it's best not to say anything. Because, in our way of trying to comfort, sometimes we say the wrong things. Sometimes we say things that that are best left unsaid. There are things that we don't know about when it comes to providence and how God works in the realm of that which we call providence, and we try to sometimes make sense of what's going on in a person's life, and sometimes we can make matters worse. We can make matters worse. And so it's sometimes best just to be there and listen. Listen to what's being said and to say, I'll pray for you, I'll be here for you, instead of trying to place blame, especially trying to place blame on someone when they've undergone such a tragedy as Job has. So we're learning a lot of lessons on certain things about God and the character of God from the book of Job. Also about what not to do, what not to say when it comes to helping someone who's in distress. Verse 7 of Job chapter 12 through verse 12 is Job talking about the providence of God and how that he takes care of the created order. And he says in verse 7, but now ask the beast, and they will teach you, the birds of the air, and they will tell you, or speak to the earth, and it will teach you, and the fish of the sea will explain to you. Who among all these does not know that the hand of the Lord has done this, in whose hand is the life of every living thing, and the breath of all mankind? Does not the ear test words, and the mouth taste its food? Wisdom is with aged men, and with length of days understanding. I think verses 7 through 10 are some of the most beautiful words that you find in the book of Job concerning how the created order understands things about God that we can learn from if we look at it. There is so much that we can learn from when we look at the beast and we look at the birds of the air and we look at the earth and how God takes care of the earth and the fish of the sea. The amazing design that's there, the way God provides for those animals and those creatures. They thrive, and they're animals that they're taken care of in the natural realm sometimes when men are nowhere else to be found. And sometimes men think that they've got to be there to take care of the animals, and the animals usually take care of themselves within the natural realm. God provides for them. In fact, in Job chapter 38, a little bit later on in this book, God is going to give the animal kingdom as examples of Him taking care of His creation. And basically say to Job, Job, I can take care of all of this. Don't you think I can take care of you? And Job here has an understanding of this to a certain degree. But, you look at it from the standpoint of what we can learn from the animal kingdom, what we can learn from the birds of the air. You think of it from a very practical standpoint as far as how looking at the natural world has helped us. What do you think people were looking at when they started designing airplanes and thinking about flight? Birds. The birds have been doing it for thousands of years. And people say, well, if we're going to fly, we need to look at the creatures that do that. We can learn from them. What do you think people were looking at when they were starting to make submarines, aquatic devices? They were looking at the marine creatures. Say, well, here's how they're designed. Here's how they make it through the water. And there's their body types and such. So our submarines shaped very much like the whales and the dolphins that you see. There's so much to learn. I mean, so many examples you can give. And what do you think people were thinking of and examining in the natural realm when they were looking at microphones? The ear. Cameras. The eye. All of the things that we have in technology, almost all of them are based upon something in nature. Something God already made. So there's much that we can learn from the natural order. And verse 10 says, in whose hand is the life of every living thing and the breath of all mankind. That's God taking care of the world. And the breath of every mankind shows His sovereignty over mankind as well. Any questions or comments about that before we go any further? Do we not find sometimes even in the book of Proverbs, they will say, look at the ant, how industrious they are. Or look at the sluggard. You don't want to be like the sluggard, lazy. Animals are set forth as examples. Did not even Jesus do that? Behold the lilies of the field. Behold the birds of the air. They neither toil nor reap, but God takes care of them. So looking at the natural realm as something that can help us appreciate God more. That's why it's good for us to do that from time to time. Verse 12 of chapter 12 talks about wisdom is with the aged men and with length of days understanding. The way the Bible depicts getting older, the way it should be is you get wiser. That's how it should be. Not always the case, but that's the way it should be. The older you get, the wiser you get, the more understanding you have of God's will. Look at chapter 13. Job chapter 13. In chapter 13 and 14, well, we're not going to look at all these passages, but be sure and read verses 13 through 25 as it talks about God and how He's in control of things. That's His providence. Verses 13 through 25 there of Job chapter 12. How He does these things. He leads this. He loosens this. He pours out. He uncovers. Talking about God and the providence of what He does. You look at chapter 13, verses 1 through 3. Job says, behold, my eye has seen all this. My ear has heard and understood it. What you know, I also know. I am not inferior to you, but I would speak to the Almighty and desire to reason with God. So Job is setting forth once again how that he sees what's going on. His ear understands what is being said. And he said, I'm not inferior to you, talking to his friends, but he wants to speak to the Almighty, verse 3. He wants an audience with the Almighty. I desire to reason with God. It's very interesting when God does speak to him and talk with him. And look at chapter 40 and verse 3. When that happens, look at chapter 40. Job chapter 40. Job is in chapter 13. He's pretty upfront with his desire to reason with God. He wants to talk with God. And all through this, we're going to see he wants to make his case towards God. Why is this happening to me? But when God speaks to him, notice what happens. Job 40 and verse 1. Moreover, the Lord answered Job and said, shall the one who contends with the Almighty correct him? He who rebukes God, let him answer it. Verse 3, Then Job answered the Lord and said, Behold, I am vile. What shall I answer you? I lay my hand over my mouth. Once I have spoken, but I will not answer. Yes, twice I will proceed no further. I don't have anything to say. You look at verse 6. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, Now prepare yourself like a man, and I will question you, and you shall answer me. So now God is questioning Job. We'll get to that in more detail when we get to those chapters. But here Job, out of distress, is wanting to talk to God. He's wanting to know why this is happening to him. Now look at verses 15 through 19 of Job 13. Verses 15 through 19. Here's one of these statements of faith that he has. He has a lot of questions, but he has faith in God, trust in God. Though he slay me, yet will I trust him. Even so, I will defend my own ways before him. He also shall be my salvation, for a hypocrite could not come before him. Listen carefully to my speech and to my declaration with your ears. See now, I have prepared my case. I know that I shall be vindicated. Shall be vindicated, verse 18. Who is he who will contend with me? If now I hold my tongue, I perish. Notice what he says there in verse 15. Though he slay me, though God slay me, yet will I trust him. That is a tremendous statement of faith and trust in God. He doesn't know what's going on. He doesn't know. He has a lot of answers. He's got a lot of questions. However, he still trusts God. Even if he kills me, he says, I'm still going to trust him. So, when we have tragedy and problems in our life and have questions, there's nothing wrong with having questions. I mean, I have a lot of questions about a lot of things. But we have to maintain that trust and say, no matter what happens, I'm going to trust God. Even if he kills me, I'm going to trust him. He knows what's best. And that's what we see here with Job. Though he slay me, yet will I trust him. That's something you ought to underline in your Bible. That is a tremendous statement of faith. No matter what happens, I'm going to trust God. It's very interesting in verse 16 of that same chapter. He says, He shall be my salvation, for a hypocrite could not come before him. The condemnation of hypocrisy is throughout the Bible. Not being genuine. Being something on the outside that you're not on the inside. Acting one way, pretending to be something that you're not, and then being something else. The word hypocrisy in the New Testament is from a Greek word that refers to an actor. Someone that would pretend. They would actually put on a mask in their theaters and they would play a part, and then the same actor would put on another mask and play a different part. Same actor, but they had two different masks they would put on. That is what Jesus condemned more often. Hypocrisy. And he used the word hypocrite over and over again to describe the religious leaders. And Job is saying here a hypocrite could not come before him. And he recognizes that God is his salvation there in verse 16. Now look at Job 14. Job is continuing to talk here. Job 14 and verse 1. Man who is born of woman is a few days and full of trouble. He comes forth like a flower and fades away. He flees like a shadow and does not continue. And do you open your eyes on such a one and bring me to judgment with yourself? Who can bring a clean thing out of an unclean? No one. Since his days are determined, the number of his months is with you. You have appointed his limits so that he cannot pass. Look away from him that he may rest, till like a hired man he finishes his day. Verse 1 is talking about our life on earth, and man who's born of woman, that would include every human being, is a few days and full of trouble. We're born into this world. We're born into an imperfect world. And a few days and full of trouble. Now, Job is seeing this from a very pessimistic standpoint because of everything that's going on with him. But we are born into a world that's imperfect and has a lot of flaws in it. And as of a few days, we've talked about this before, how that earlier in the book of Job talked about how that our days are like a vapor, like a cloud that only appears for a short time. James chapter 4 talks about that. That we're just here for a short time. Few days and full of trouble. Verse 2, he says, he comes forth like a flower and fades away. It's like a flower that grows up, then it's gone. It's gone. It's no longer there. He flees like a shadow and does not continue. So again, he's talking about how life is fleeting, is short. It's full of difficulty. At best, there's difficulty in living this life. And on down further, in verse 5 and 6 of Job chapter 14, he talks about the limitation of a person's life. There's a beginning, there's an end. And he says, you've numbered the months. You've put a limit. In verse 5, you've appointed a limit that he will not pass. We as humans have a limited period of time here upon the earth, and once that's over with, we pass on. I've often said before, in talking about a person's life, when you look at an obituary or you look at a gravestone and it gives the date of their birth and then the date of their death, that little space in between is their life. That's their life. And we need to think very seriously about how we're conducting ourselves here upon the earth. And how that we are relating to God. And living for eternity. Knowing that there will be an eternity for us to face. And so we live in the here and now for God. And that's something that is taken away as far as the fear is concerned. Because we know the hope that lies with those who are faithful. He talks about how that in verse 6, it's like a hired man, he finishes his day. He's at the end of his work. He works from beginning of the day to the end of day, then that work is over with. That's how life is. That's how life is on the earth. But then further on in chapter 14, he talks about death, but there is a glimmer of hope. Life is rough. You're going to have a limited space here upon the earth of time. Then you die. But is there hope? Look at verse 7. For there is hope for a tree, if it is cut down, that it will sprout again, and that its tender shoots will not cease. Though its roots may grow old in the earth, and its stump may die in the ground, yet at the scent of water it will bud, and bring forth branches like a plant. But man dies and is laid away. Indeed, he breathes his last, and where is he? As water disappears from the sea, and a river becomes parched and dries up, so man lies down and does not rise, till the heavens are no more, they will not awake, nor be aroused from their sleep. Did you notice that? Till, you might have until in your translation. Man does not arise from death until the heavens are no more. That's talking about the end of time. What's going to happen at the end of time? What's going to happen when Jesus returns? The dead will rise. There will be a judgment day. There will be a resurrection. Part of the events that happens when Jesus returns is He's going to raise the dead. John chapter 5. He says, those who are in their grave, all those who are in their graves will hear His voice and come forth. They that have done good unto the resurrection of life, they that have done evil unto the resurrection of condemnation. It's talking about the end of time. And when that happens, Job here had an understanding of that to a certain degree. He understood that man, when he dies, it's all over with as far as rising up again till, verse 12, the heavens are no more. They will not awake, nor be aroused from sleep. Now, mark this down always. Put this in your brain. Write it on your sleeve. Write it on your hand. Write it on your neighbor's hand. When the Bible talks about sleep in death, it refers to the body. It never refers to the soul. The soul isn't sleeping. The body sleeps. It appears to be sleeping. It's inanimate anymore. It doesn't have any animation in it anymore. I mean, when you go to a funeral and you look, it appears that person is asleep. And so when it talks about being asleep in death, it's referring to the corpse, the body. It's not referring to the soul. And look at verse 13 through 15, Job 14, 13 through 15. Oh, that you would hide me in the grave, that you would conceal me until your wrath is past, that you would appoint me a set time and remember me. Look at verse 14. If a man dies, shall he live again? That's a very important question that man has always asked. If a man dies, shall he live again? Notice what he says. All the days of my hard service I will wait till my change comes. You shall call and I will answer you. You shall desire the work of your hands. So he's asking the question in verse 14, if a person dies, is there life after death? And then he goes on and he says, I'll wait till my change comes. Now what does 1 Corinthians chapter 15 talk about in the New Testament? There will be a change. In a moment, in the twinkle of an eye, when Christ returns, the dead will be raised immortal. Those who are alive and remain on the earth that are God's people, when Christ returns, they'll be changed. So Job, to a certain extent, understood there's something going to happen at the end of time that's going to result in a resurrection from the dead. He says in verse 15, you shall call and I will answer you. The call there and the answering is referring to what Jesus was talking about. All those that are in the grave shall call forth. They're going to hear the Son of Man. They're going to hear Him and they're going to come forth. Then there's going to be two categories. Those that have done good unto the resurrection of life. Those that have done evil unto the resurrection of condemnation. So he has a concept here of a resurrection at the end of time. Now, there's a lot about that he doesn't fully understand because he doesn't have the rest of the revelation that we have in the Bible. We have the rest of the story. But he had an understanding during the patriarchal period of a life after death. Now, very quickly, let's look at this concept of a life after death that was understood in the Old Testament. There's a phrase that you come across several times called gathered to his people. Gathered to his people. And it refers to a person when they die, how their spirit departs from this body and they're gathered to their people. And it's referring to those that have passed on before them in the spiritual realm, known as Sheol and also known as Hades, of course, in the New Testament. Look at Genesis chapter 25. We might have just enough time to get this in. Genesis chapter 25, verse 7 and 8. Of course, Moses is writing Genesis. Genesis 25, verse 7 and 8. This is the sum of the years of Abraham's life which he lived, 175 years. Then Abraham breathed his last and died in a good old age, an old man full of years, and he was gathered to his people. That phrase is talking about going into the afterlife. Look at Genesis 25, 17. Genesis 25 and verse 17. These were the years of the life of Ishmael, 137 years. And he breathed his last and died and was gathered to his people. I looked this up in the Hebrew, and it refers to assembling with his people. That's where his spirit went. His spirit left his body and went into the afterlife. He assembled with his people. Look at Genesis 35. Genesis 35, verse 28 and 29. Now the days of Isaac were 180 years. So Isaac breathed his last and died and was gathered to his people, being old and full of days, and his sons Esau and Jacob buried him. So there's that phrase again. He died and was gathered to his people. Look at Genesis chapter 49. Genesis 49 and verse 33. And when Jacob had finished commanding his sons, he drew his feet up into the bed and breathed his last and was gathered to his people. Now some have interpreted the gathered to his people, and that meant, well, they buried him in a common place where his people were buried. It cannot mean that. Where is Jacob dying here? He's in Egypt. What would the people do when they are released from Egyptian bondage? What were they going to do with Jacob's body? Take his remains back to the promised land and bury him there in the promised land. They embalmed his body, and they were going to take his body back to the promised land when the people were released from Egyptian bondage. But this was going to be hundreds of years down the road. When he died, in verse 49, chapter 49, verse 33, when he died, he was gathered to his people. Again, that is the spirit departing the body and going into the afterlife. So it cannot be referring to being buried in the family burial place, because Jacob was gathered to his people when he died in Egypt. So we find that phrase. Look at Deuteronomy 32, verses 48 through 50. Deuteronomy 32, verses 48 through 50. Lord speaking to Moses here, talking about the death he was about to die. How that Aaron died and how Moses was going to die. In Deuteronomy 32, verse 48 through 50, then the Lord spoke to Moses that very same day, saying, Go up to the mountain of Abram, Mount Nebo, which is in the land of Moab, across from Jericho. View the land of Canaan, which I give to the children of Israel as a possession. Now notice verse 50. And die on the mountain which you ascend, and be gathered to your people, just as Aaron your brother died on Mount Hor, and was gathered to his people. You see, Aaron wasn't allowed to go into the promised land either. And so that was the consequences of their sins for what Aaron did, remember at the foot of Mount Sinai, and what Moses did in striking the rock when he should have spoke to it. This is the consequences of their sins. He says, you die where you're going to die there on the mountain. I'm going to give you a vision of the promised land, but you die there on the mountain and be gathered to your people, as Aaron died and was gathered to his people. So these phrases here indicate that there was an understanding of death being not the end of everything. There is life beyond the dying process, in which people left this realm, but they went into another realm. Of course, we see that really defined in other passages of the Old Testament as well. I mean, you can see it in various passages. Look at Psalm 23 and consider the hope that David had. The 23rd Psalm, in talking about the Lord being his shepherd. And notice what it says in verse 6. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. He full well expected to be with God for eternity. And so that's another phrase, or another way of saying, be gathered to his people. So Job had an understanding, as limited as it may have been, based upon, just the information that was given to the patriarchs, that there is going to be a resurrection of the dead, that there is life after death. If a man dies, shall he live again? The answer is yes. And the definitive proof of that is the empty tomb in Jerusalem. Jesus resurrecting on the third day was proof positive that there is life after death. So Job here is recognizing that. Job, even though in distress and in sorrow, says that even though he slay me, I will trust him, and had a hope of a resurrection, a hope of being with God. And there's other passages that we're going to look at in the book of Job the next time we have opportunity, that indicate that Job had an understanding of an afterlife. And so, beautiful depiction of the hope a man in tremendous distress had. That's all for this class. Be reading the second cycle of speeches, chapter 15 through 21, and we'll look at various passages from that section, Lord willing, next week.